timing, wasn't it?
So,
I won't know until I've got the agenda.
kia ora tātou, nau mai, haere mai, welcome back to our Extraordinary Committee of Council meeting, our annual plan and budget debate of Thursday the 3rd of March 2022. We are now, councillors and staff and people online, we are now on to Schedule F. And Cameron, I'll come back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So Schedule F, what that outlines in your papers is basically the program as adopted in the 10-year plan, where we have not proposed any changes to that program. So all the other schedules to this point have outlined where we've had variations to the program of varying degrees. This schedule here is to remind ourselves as to what was included in the 10-year plan and is still included in the 10-year plan. Thank you.
All right, and there's no slide for this. It's just refer to the papers. Okay. All right, councillors, so we're referring to the papers. I'm just trying to get to the start of them because there are a few. Yes, so it's from page 32 of your papers. All right. I'll open it up for any questions. And Councillor Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I can't recall if I've asked this question already and I can't find the answer, so apologies if this has been covered. But on page 26 of the supporting material, under city reserves, under expenses, there's an increase of $1.3 million from the 10-year plan amount to the draft annual budget amount. It's from 4 million and it's increased to 5.2. And it says changes in the way labour costs are allocated has resulted in a change of cost structure for each of these sub-activities. So, and I think I did ask a question to find out where the corresponding savings might be for that, if it's actually about how something's allocated. But I haven't got a good understanding of what's driving that increase, and I'm just wondering if anyone's able to explain why that has increased, because it doesn't seem to have come through in our schedule of appendices. I can't seem to be able to figure out what that increase is.
Steve Patterson, Strategy Manager Finance. I'll have a crack first, and then if I need to be fixed in terms of Kathy having another say, that's fine. But certainly in terms of the big picture, you're right, there are quite significant changes reflected in there in terms of the way in which the costs are shown in those subsets of that bigger overall active communities page. And a lot of it results from significant changes that there have been to the way in which costs are shared amongst the particular activities and the way the costs are then allocated. You asked the question, where do I see the reductions? And it's not really that obvious because it actually permeates the whole of the council, really, given some of the types of costs that are incurred in that activity. So I'm not sure whether Kathy has a better understanding of the things that might help further than that, but that's the general picture. We looked to see if we could give you more detail of where that might show in terms of the savings, but it's not not that obvious.
I guess perhaps to ask a clearer question, is it a transfer of cost, or is it an increase in cost, or is it a mixture of both?
So Kathy Devertodd, Group Manager, Parks and Logistics. Councillor, it is a combination of both. One of the things we did was restructure the underlying overhead to give you a clearer and more accurate picture of the cost of service provision for each of the activities that sat under it. Previously, overheads were grouped together and then allocated across, so there's part of that. And councillors, you will recall that we have been increasing the base of parks, and over time we have requested increases in through MSL budget, the costs associated with that. But coming with that in the overheads is things like increased costs in insurance and those other things that as a result of an increasing base of assets.
Okay, thank you. And so if some is transfer and some is an increase in cost, where would we find this reflected in the schedule of changes in our papers for today?
As I tried to outline, Councillor, it's not just that obvious, and there's no one particular place that you can see the reductions. It's right across the whole breadth of the parts of the infrastructure where things have been allocated differently. But so in terms of the big picture, I think we just need to, we started to try to look at this, but then there just wasn't a way of bringing it together that was going to sensibly help you in understanding that. So I'm sorry about that, but that's how we ended up just trying to.
I've really looked quite hard and I can't sort of see any evidence of the reduction through that I'm hearing that there's a transfer, but I'm not really seeing any evidence of the reduction.
Councillors, if you were to look at something like cemeteries, you will see that the operating costs for cemeteries have lowered slightly, even though we've had an increase in the cemetery. That is largely as a result of the way in which we've been accounting for our overheads in parks and reserves as a division and how that's been redistributed. So, combination of both, growth and demand and sort of some reallocation, but that is one area where you can see despite growth, the overall operating costs have actually gone down slightly.
Okay, thank you for answering the question.
All right. No other questions online or in the chamber? All right, we have a number of notices of motion, so we'll go through those. We'll get the first one up. So this is around Schedule F, and committee notice of motion is around committee recommending that the following programs funding is reduced. Program 86, which is 103 capital renewal furniture replacements, 9, and that's reduced to 50,000. So that's moved by Councillor Naylor, supported by, or seconded by Councillor Petrinas. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. There are a number of recommendations that I'm putting forward that perhaps are fairly small in the overall scheme of things, which I hadn't intended to perhaps progress if some of the previous larger ones had been successful. But given that we haven't made too much traction in any reductions, I'm certainly willing to test the waters on some of these to see if we can find a few areas that may be a lower priority of investment for our ratepayers. So this is a capital renewal program, furniture replacements, and I understand that we have invested about 100,000 in this year as well, and have had quite a significant amount of new furniture replaced. So in terms of going forward, just trying to compensate for perhaps some of the additions to the budget where we've seen, you know, which we've talked about today. This is one I think that perhaps could be deferred, and certainly to reduce that to 50,000 I think is a reasonable way to do that. So I'd just like, to consider that.
Thank you, Councillor. No other councillors commenting? No. All right, this is one I will support, councillors. I think, again, as Councillor Naylor said, is probably something that can be deferred. Having working in this building, I've seen a lot of new furniture, and that's great. It's modernising the place, but with double-digit rate increases coming, this is something that perhaps could be deferred. So I'd like you to consider it at least. We're not cancelling it, we're just deferring it. Okay, back to you, Councillor, for any right or reply. Oh, there is, sorry, before we do, there's another councillor in the queue. Sorry, he didn't come up online. So, Councillor Johnson?
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I noticed that a couple of times in this debate you've referred to double-digit rate increases. But my understanding is that when we started this debate, that the rate increase was looking at about 8.4%. Has there been some sort of on-the-go calculations done that are now saying we're looking at a 10% and above for rate increases? I don't quite understand.
I'll just ask Steve to explain, because that's coming up next, Councillor.
Steve Patterson, Strategy Manager Finance. As things stand right at the moment, you've moved from where you started at 8.4 to 8.3% overall increase in the total rates, but I suspect that some of the references earlier on might have been to what the impact will be on the average ratepayer, which was a bit higher than that, perhaps.
Okay, so in fact, we aren't proposing double-digit rate increases, so I'm not quite sure why the Mayor keeps referring to that.
I think you'll find out, Councillor, when we come to it, but let's just hold that comment till we come to it.
Well, first of all, we aren't proposing double-digit rate increases, so I think it's important to establish that. And secondly, any disproportionate effect on some ratepayers because of valuations is out of our control. So I'm not sure it's correct.
Sorry, Councillor, it's coming in number 2.
Increases.
So which is your comment on this particular item?
Well, I'm concerned that perhaps councillors are being misled by your repeated references to double-digit rate increases, when in fact the officers have just confirmed that we're looking at 8.3 at the moment.
Currently looking at 8.3, you're correct and technically correct. As I said, we'll look to what it falls at after number 2. So back to you. Is there anything else you want to comment on with this particular one, Councillor?
No, that was it.
Good, thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. In terms of, just to give some context for what is motivating me to be quite proactive in looking at reductions, just in terms answering, perhaps addressing the question that Councillor Johnson has raised, the disproportionate distribution of the rates because of the revaluation actually is a consideration that we should be thinking about as we strike the rates increase. Yes, even if it's 8.3 or 8.4, what I understand from the papers is that will be 11.5% or more to your average residential ratepayer. So that does need to be a part of the context that sits behind our thinking when we determine whether it's 8.4 or 5.4 or whatever. So those are determining whether it's 8.4 or 5.4 or whatever actually is within our control, and that does have an influence on whether we end up with a double-digit rates increase. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge that. I don't think I need to speak further to the actual program other than to say it's a reduction to 50,000. So some of it could be deferred to a later date, but it's acknowledging that there would still be some investment in this area.
Okay, councillors, if you can just vote, please. One to come, please. And that is passed 11 votes for and 5 against. All right, we'll move to the next one. And this is around Schedule F as well. It's around the committee recommending that the following program funding is reduced. Program 2047, at 154,000 of capital new furniture transformation reduced to 75,000. Again, brought forward by Councillor Naylor and seconded by Councillor Petrinas. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I don't probably need to add too much, really the same rationale as the previous item, other than to say I'm not quite sure why it's even called furniture transformation. I think transformation occurs through effective leadership, not through buying furniture. So certainly I think this is another area that we could reduce to 75 and defer the rest.
Councillors, for the same reasons as my comments earlier, I support this and I would hope that you do as well. No further comments, nothing online, so back to you, Councillor, if you need a right to reply. You don't, we will vote, please. And that is passed 11 votes for and 5 against. Okay, we move to the next one, which is again Schedule F. The committee recommending that the following program funding is reduced. This is program 1826 of 308,000 capital new. It's around this administration building workplace transformation, and it's reducing that to 150,000. That's brought forward by Councillor Naylor and seconded by Councillor Petrinas. Councillor Naylor.
For very much the same reasons as the previous two items. I think this is something that we could reduce, that we could invest 150,000 in this year and defer the rest. Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I wonder if we could just hear from staff on the implications of this cut, please.
Yes, I'll get somebody.
Bryce Hosking, Group Manager Property. The planned work for this next year was to do the design work for creating an external tenancy on the ground floor. So once staff have lifted off that floor and we'll be looking to create an external tenancy, this was to design that. Obviously that tenancy will then be leased out, so it will be creating revenue that's currently unbudgeted for, so that's a bonus. If this was to be reduced in half, unsure at this stage of whether we would actually be able to complete that design work. Yeah, probably not much more I can say.
Thank you for that explanation. I think it's very helpful. Thank you.
Councillor Butt.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Question from Bryce again. Are we spending all this money to get that tenancy?
So this is for the design of the ground floor, or the redesign of the ground floor. It's not actually the physical work yet, but this will inform the physical work. So by deferring this, it will then have implications on when we could actually implement the actual work.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any further questions? Councillor Johnson, you're on again, but is that from last time?
Well, I have got a comment as well once we get into comment, please.
We are in comment, yep.
Okay. So my comment is that I'm not supporting this, and I notice this trend of just halving budgets, which seems to be extremely arbitrary decision making to me. I fear that through perhaps a misguided sense of trying to save ratepayers' money, all sorts of cuts have been voted through, and actually, as the questioning of the officer showed, elected members have really got no understanding of what these budgets if they're cut in half, what the implications are. So an example with this budget is cutting it in half actually stops the ability to do the work altogether. So I'm not really sure where this rationale is coming from to just halve things, unless it's some kind of, no, well, I won't speculate. But basically, I'm not going to support this because half the budget is not very useful in this case. And I would caution elected members that this seeming desire to be seen to be cutting things has unintended consequences. And unless we're very clear about what we're cutting, I think we're going to end up in difficulty here. So just caution this route that we appear to be going down. Thank you.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't be supporting this recommendation. The point of this programme is to repurpose underutilised space in the CAB, which absolutely is, well, might be transformative for the people working in it, but more importantly, from my perspective, is transformative in that part of the central city, where anybody who walks around that part of town knows that our own CAB actually drags down some of the amenity value in that space. So this is actually a really valuable programme for central city amenity and activation, and so I really would like to see it go forward.
Okay, back to you, Councillor Naylor, for right reply.
Thank you. I did ask a question through the officers in previous days as to what this program was to be used for, and the answer that I got back was the purpose of this program is to proactively refurbish the CAB to ensure council is able to create work environments which are fit for purpose and meet the current and future needs of council employees. In addition, the program enables opportunities within the CAB to lease space to external parties. I'm actually also supportive of the concept of creating an opportunity to lease parts of the CAB to external parties, but from the answer, it seemed that that was a part of this program and certainly not all of it. I also would like to just say to the comment that suggested that maybe this was a misguided sense of trying to save money from the ratepayers. Actually, this is a genuine attempt to save the money for the ratepayers, and I make no apology for that. I don't think there's anything misguided at all about what I'm trying to do here today, and I would encourage elected members to actually take their role seriously and think about every single dollar that we approve is coming from ratepayers' pockets. And that's definitely something that sits heavily on my shoulders and should sit heavily on all of our shoulders. I would encourage you to support this today.
All right, thank you, Councillor. Let's vote on this, please. And that has failed. 9 votes against and 7 for. All right, I think we're now to Schedule F, the next one. All right, staying with Schedule F, and this is around the committee recommending that the following program is deferred to financial year 2023-24, and that's program 2044. It's 197,000. It's operational, is that right? OP means operational, yep, just getting the terminology right. Curbside food waste, investigations and trial, and deferring that to the 23-24 year. And that's moved by Councillor Naylor and seconded by Councillor Petrinas. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. As with many of the programs, all the programs in our long-term plan, this program is a piece of work that will be very important to deliver at some point. Looking at the resource recovery operational spend this year and next year and the following year for the 3 years and the first 3 years of the long-term plan, it's quite lumpy. This year is $280,000. The year 2 amount was $576,000, and we've added in some extra into that with the free rubbish bags. So it's actually over $600,000. So that's more than doubling that program for the year 2. And then it goes back down to 348 for next year, for year 3. So I don't know if you guys recall, but certainly there was some pieces of work that were important that we didn't feel like we could afford last year, and a lot of them got pushed into year 2. And what that's meant is it's a bit lumpy in terms of the distribution of programs. I did ask officers the question as to how realistic it was for all of the programs within this area to be delivered, and I had considered another program also to be reconsidered, but I'm just focusing on this one for now, because I'm not intending to move for the other one to be deferred. But I think looking at the work program and looking at how the level of priority of this piece of work, I do think it could wait a year. I think what that would mean is that it smooths perhaps the work over the 3 years in a more affordable way. And I think it's certainly something that we can consider in our annual budget next year if it is deferred. So those are the reasons why I've put it forward. I'm not suggesting it's not worthy of our consideration at some point, but I do think it could wait a year.
Okay, Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I'm pleased to hear that the mover acknowledges the value of the program and is only concerned around the timing of it, because it certainly is something that the community has been asking for a long time. And in fact, when you travel now to a number of communities throughout the country, you see that they actually have these programs well and truly underway, achieving the strategic aims around diverting waste that's currently lost to landfill and actually turning it into beneficial products. So very pleased to hear again that there is support around the rationale. The timing of this, though, is also quite important in that the reason that we need a trial at this stage is that it actually gives us information that we can use in the decision-making process coming into the next long-term plan. So actually it's quite critical that we hit this window and get the trial underway, get the investigations underway, so that actually when we come into that long-term plan cycle, we have evidence on which to make a proper decision around an ongoing solution or not, depending on how the investigations and trial goes. But it is very important that we actually hold the timing in this year so we get that information when we need it.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too do not support this. I agree with Councillor Barrett, and actually this has been deferred and we've been waiting for this for ages. This has been under discussion for about the last 5 years, and we do need to get this trial underway and get some budget. So no, I don't think I want to wait any longer, and nor do a lot of the ratepayers want to wait for it. So I won't be supporting it.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a question. To my understanding, a trial or experiment on the same kind of program is already on, and we have already bought some equipment or plant, if I'm not wrong. So I would like some comments from the officers. Delaying this project will affect on that plant, or what will be there?
We're just trying to get you an answer.
Chair, Sarah Sinclair, Chief Infrastructure Officer. We do have a commercial food waste trial going on with the shopping centre at the moment that is going into the compost. We've also got a separate process already underway which collects waste for the digester at the treatment plant. So yes, there are already trials underway.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll come back to you, councillor, for right of reply.
Thank you. Just to add, as the previous few items were capital new and capital renewal, which obviously have a little bit less impact on rates. However, just wanted to highlight that this is an operational program. It's quite a big one, so it does make around 0.2% of rates increase whether we vote to keep it in or whether we take it out. That would obviously shift that level down a little bit more significantly. So I just like think that should be a part of the consideration in this, particularly considering how much we've added into our operational budget today.
Okay, can we vote, please? Councillor Johnson, can you vote, please?
Sorry, I voted in the chat box and it showed for me that I had voted, but anyway, my vote was no.
Okay, that has failed. 10 votes against and 6 for. Okay, we will now move through to the next one, which is again Schedule F, and this is around the committee recommending the following operational program is reduced. Program 1929, 256,000 of OPEX workforce transformation reduced to 125,000. Moved by Councillor Naylor, seconded by Councillor Petrinas. Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Other elected members may have also observed that we do have quite a few little bits and pieces of programs that seem to all relate to workforce transformation. This is the operational one. I think in light of the additional $1 million that we've approved today for the Health and Safety Improvement Program, if you've read through that presentation and from what we heard a couple of weeks ago, there's some quite significant elements in that program of leadership and culture. I actually think that given that that is progressing as per the vote today, I think there's a bit of an overlap with some of the work that began a few years ago that was traditionally called workforce transformation. I don't know if we, as I said before, I think the most significant transformation comes, from effective leadership. And I don't know if investing another 256,000 this year in that piece of work will necessarily deliver the results that that level of investment deserves on behalf of ratepayers. So I'm proposing that we reduce it to 125,000.
Okay, Councillor Beattie.
May I ask, please, the impact of taking this money out?
Okay, I'll ask Mr. Wilson to speak to it.
This is the budget Well, through you, Mr. Chair, Wayne Wilson, People Ops. This is the budget we use for staff development, so the programs that come under this future report development, leadership capability, capability development of staff, and employee experience, which is all around the culture and stuff like that. So that's the programs that we're working on there. Reducing it, of course, just reduces the ability to fund those programs and deliver them.
Councillor Beattie, any comments?
Yes, coming from that, I won't support this. I think it's absolutely important that we have staff development and leadership programs in place, especially as we've got a shortage of vacancies where staff are being moved around the organisation. So development is very much more important.
Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to oppose this. I recall when these transformation budgets first came in a couple of years back now, the reason that there were so many line items, I guess, under the heading of transformation, including, furniture, culture, people, operations, those sorts of things. My recollection was that we asked for there to be clearer lines of sight rather than a big one large program that sort of just had a whole mashup of budget. And so there was a separation to sort of lay out quite clearly what the aspects of organisational transformation actually meant and the staged approach over a number of years. So I do think that it's getting into a little bit nitpicky here, because actually we've identified through our quarterly health and safety reports, through numerous debates, through this discussion over the last couple of days, that we know that there is still need for transformational work within our organisation. And I'm not interested in slashing budgets in this space now. I think actually we've started the work and we need to keep going on it.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. No, I'm not interested in cutting a staff development budget, and I also don't support the persistent attempts to reduce wages, conditions, and other development for staff. I've said before, staff are our biggest asset, and staff are the people that we need to be supporting to do the work for the city. And so I really think this is part of an overall picture which, if all of these things were passed, would be quite demoralising to staff. So I'm certainly not prepared to support it. Thank you.
Before I go back to you, Councillor, for right of reply, I am going to support you. I think Mr. Wilson pretty well repeated everything that was happening in the $1 million increase around leadership, staff development, and that wider health and safety program. So this is a time when we need to cut our cloth. This is not demoralising the staff. This is absolutely cutting our cloth to try and, the very people that we're supposedly helping, we're going to be taxing more. So I do support the Councillor Naylor's recommendation and hope that you may do it as well. Thank you. Back to you for right of reply, Councillor.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with what the Mayor has just covered. I do think this does seem to be quite an overlap in what's been described in that new $1 million health and safety improvement program, where in terms of leadership capability, etc. This is not a target for wages and conditions at all, as far as I understand. And I'd just like to acknowledge this is actually still endorsing $125,000 to be invested in this area, which is not insignificant. So I think the $125,000 on top of the other $1 million should be plenty of capability to deliver some of these improvements within the organisation.
All right, councillors, we'll vote, please. and that has failed with 9 votes against and 7 votes for. So we'll now move on to the next one, which again was Schedule F, and this is around the committee recommending that the following operational program is removed. Program 1936, it's $30,000 operational, funding for Section 17A reviews. Moved by Councillor Naylor, seconded by Councillor Petrinas. Over to you, Councillor.
Thank you. I did ask a question about whether there were any Section 17A reviews planned for the next financial year, and I think the answer was that consideration will be given over the next 12 to 18 months about whether there is any area that would need to be identified for this sort of work, and that would be in preparation for the next LTP. Historically, some of you around the table might remember that we've had, it didn't used to be a regular item in our program, but we had to have a paper that was brought to us when that was required, that required us to approve some additional budget, and then it was suggested perhaps we could just pop it in the budget every year just in case it's needed. I guess what I'm suggesting now is that perhaps a different approach might be relevant for this year, particularly if there's no specific work identified or planned for the next financial year, that we remove it, obviously leave it in for the following year, which I think it's scheduled to be a little bit more, 51,000 in year 3. And if it actually does become apparent that that is needed, it can always come back to the table, and perhaps my observations of programs that are budgeted and rated for but perhaps aren't needed is that I think there's an advantage in us having some oversight or visibility if that budget isn't needed, either what it might be used for, or if it's not needed, then we don't have to rate the ratepayers for it. So I think there's an advantage. It's a small amount, obviously, but I think every little bit adds up. It's an operational budget. I'd encourage you to support removing it on that basis.
Okay, Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Probably more than most of you, I would very much like us not to have to do Section 17A reviews, but rather unfortunately we do. And it's not all that long ago, elected members, you will recall that we agreed to a rolling programme of Section 17A reviews for the very good reason that that gives certainty and clarity of process to our CCOs who are the subjects of our Section 17A reviews. The issues that we've faced in the past is that we pluck a Section 17A review out of thin air in response to perceived problems. And we took a decision to move away from that reactive process into a more proactive and with the intention of being helpful process towards our CCOs. So I'd be very disappointed if we went back to that reactive dealing with problems approach rather than the approach which this budget facilitates, which is working proactively with our CCOs to deliver really good outcomes for our community. So I won't be supporting this. Thank you.
Okay, no other comments around the table. We'll go back to, Councillor Harpiter.
Could we get a comment from the officers? So I know Councillor Naylor said there was nothing planned for the next financial year. So is that still the case? Sorry, Acting Chief Executive.
At this stage, there's no explicit 17A review planned in the coming financial year. However, one of the things we're doing in the lead up to the next long-term plan is undertaking a review of levels of service. So part of that will look at part of a Section 17A review looks at the efficiency and effectiveness of services and functions. So the work we're looking at doing in the lead up to the next LTP will look at the efficiency and effectiveness of a number of services and functions undertaken internally and externally. So the intent is that this program would be used to help fund that work. It's expected that that work will cost a lot more than $30,000. So in short, the answer is there's no explicit 17A review of a particular CCO at present. However, there's a piece of work about to commence that will look at the efficiency and effectiveness of a range of services in relation to the review of levels of service.
But where Councillor Bowen was heading was that we were going to look at reviewing all the CCOs on a rolling basis. What was your comment to that?
That's correct, and my recollection was that was the way we were going to work through those. I think Andrew may want to comment, but I don't think we have turned our mind or had any direction at this stage to explicitly look at a CCO next financial year. However, the funding would be used, as I said, because part of a Section 17A review is looking at the efficiency and effectiveness of services.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll go back to you, Councillor. No? All right. Okay, councillors, could you vote, please? And that has failed. 13 votes against and 3 for. All right, I think we're now to the substantive. Yes, we are. Okay, we'll just wait a moment until we get that sorted. Okay, so annual budget plan 2022-23, adopting supporting information and consultation document. The committee recommends 1F, that the Chief Executive incorporate the programs with no proposed change to the budget shown in year 2 of the 10-year plan as scheduled and as detailed in Schedule F in the draft of the 22-23 annual budget, incorporating the resolutions of 1, 2 and 3 above. I'm quite happy to move that, if I could have a second. Thank you, Councillor Barrett. Any comments? Councillor Johnson.
Just a question from me. Could you just indicate what the resolutions 1, 2 and 3 above are?
Furniture renewal. We're just finding out.
Thank you. Oh, that's okay. Is it, if it's only 1 and 2, then I know what they are. I just didn't know what the third one was.
Okay, includes the resolution around Program 86, which is around furniture replacement, and again on capital new furniture transformation, Program 2047.
Yeah, so it's just those two. Those were the only two I had notes of. I just didn't know what the third one was. Thank you.
Right. Any other comments? We'll vote, please. That has passed 16 votes for and none against. Thank you. Okay, we move to number 2, which is around the recommendation around The annual budget include an assumption of differentials for the general rate to be modified as outlined in Table 1 of the report, and that the uniform annual general charge be $300. Now, before we get into all of that and debating that, I'll default to you, Cameron and Steve, if you've got any slides to show us.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just while we wait to get the slides up on screen, basically what Steve, the Strategy Manager of Finance, will run you through is the work in which we've been trying to do to balance, in effect, the impacts of the rating revaluation. It has resulted in a larger increase to the residential area as opposed to others, and so we have a few tools that we've been able to use to try and balance that impact as best we can, given the tools we do have in the rating system to do so. But I'll let Steve talk you through what we have done.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve Patterson, Strategy Manager Finance. Councillors, as I reported back to you in December, and again at a workshop recently, as Cam said, the outcomes of the revaluation will have an impact on incidents. Excuse me just one moment, I'll just get some water. Thank you. So in terms of the tools that we've got available to make change, as I've mentioned to you before, they are limited to an extent if you wish to try to keep the basic principles that drive the rating system intact and defensible. The new values have a significantly higher proportion of the total value, the land value that is in the residential sector compared with the others. And so as a natural consequence, without some change to the system, there would be quite significant changes to the levels of residential rates in particular, and reductions in some of the commercial rates. So what we've done, if we go to the next slide, is looked at the incidence between the types of property that there are, and you'll be aware that from the current year to next year, there's a movement of about 3% in terms of the land value from residential, increase in the residential share of the land value. And in the current year, for the residential sector, have nearly 63%, the single unit residential sector have nearly 63% of the total rate levy. So these scenarios here that are sitting in front of you on the slides were based on an assumption that the total rates would increase by 8.4%. That's what was the material that you had before the start of today. And as it happens, we're at the moment sitting at 8.3%. So these percentages don't change as a result of that on this slide, or if they do, it's only very marginally. So in a broad sense, the third column in from the right is showing what proportion of the total rate take would be paid by the single residential sector if we made no change to the system. In other words, leave the differentials as they are and leave the uniform charge as it is. So that's 67.6, nearly 68% of the rates, up from nearly 63 in the current year. So nearly a 5% swing, if you like, in terms of that take. So as I've explained on a number of occasions, we've looked then at the differentials first and said what might happen if the differentials were changed in some way, yet still try to keep the integrity of the system in place. I've modelled various scenarios around that, and we could fill a whole day or two looking at the results of those. So it's not really that helpful, I don't think. So I've had to make some judgment calls in terms of what to bring to you. And the best that I can, in terms of my perception of what is reasonable for you to consider, are outlined on page 9 of the covering report, where it shows some proposed differences to the differentials, where in the main we're reducing a little bit the differentials that are charged on multi-unit residential properties, increasing the surcharge on commercial properties, and making some minor increases in effect to the surcharges on some of the rural properties. So those things I think we can defend in terms of the nature of the way in which the values have changed and the type of impact that would happen as well a bit later if we change the level of the uniform charge. So the two things are all wrapped up in one, in a sense. It's a package to make it seem appropriate or reasonable. And so having determined the recommendations in terms of differentials, then went on to look at what might be appropriate in terms of the uniform charge and what sort of effect that would have at various levels. So trialled it at 500, and I didn't think that you would be happy with the outcome there, so have gone to some lower levels. And the two that I've brought here to think about are 400 and 300. There's nothing particularly magic about those figures. They're round figures, but they're the sorts of levels I think that give us a sense of what can happen if we change the way in which that charge is applied. So you'll see then that progressively from the 400 down to the 300, the share of the overall rates take reduces a little bit in the residential sector, and the share that's paid by the commercial sector increases a little bit. In my view, it's not appropriate really to reduce the uniform charge any further than that, because that then impacts in other ways within the particular groups themselves and makes the use of the uniform charge itself something that is designed in the beginning to try to make sure that those at the lower end pay at least a minimum amount, and the ones at the very top end are not so extraordinarily high as to be totally unreasonable. And as I said, there's nothing absolutely magic about it, but I've settled on suggesting to you between these two particular options, 400 and 300, and you'll see in the end, in the recommendations, I erred in favour of suggesting 300. So if you look at the next slide now, Cam, thank you. Remembering these averages are based on an 8.4% increase, but I did a quick calculation at lunchtime based on the 8.3, and the average figures that are shown in that third row there with the red percentages alongside, they would move in the last two columns from down by about either $4 or $5 each. So the 3197 would become, 3197, yes, would become 3193, and which is a 12.4% increase, and the 3163 would replace 3168 in the next column across, meaning an 11.3% for the average ratepayer. So averages are odd things, as you know. They're a statistical figure that's got ranges all around it depending on the spread of values. And so it's interesting then to try and translate that into saying, well, how many properties are impacted and to what extent? by the range of values. And I don't have slides, unfortunately, that actually show that. We didn't get time to do that in the end, but in the report itself, we've got some in the Appendix H. We've got a few graphs that try to demonstrate to you what the effect would be, both in percentage terms and in dollar terms. So if you turn to page 65 in your order paper, your agenda, you'll find these slides, and I'll try to explain them to you, these graphs. If you look at the first one on page 65 at the top, it's got two scenarios, one, a blue one and an orange or brownie one. The blue one is assuming a $400 uniform charge, the other one a $300. All of these scenarios, unfortunately, are based, in a sense, on a 7% rates increase. I didn't predict too well what you're going to end up at today, and so the increases that are shown here would be marginally higher than what, or the impact would be marginally higher. But I imagine that the group's not too much different in terms of the bands that are shown here. So it's saying, if we can just interpret that, about, if you look at the highest one in the blue, that's 11 to 15% increases. And the next one, 16 to 25% increases. So that's saying about 7,000 properties, residential properties, at an overall increase of 7%, that would translate to an increase of between 11 and 15%, and just over 7,000 again would increase by between 16 and 25%. And a few, 1,500, would get over 26%. And then you can see there those things. And then if you translate that in the graph below, it's trying to say, well, if we convert that into dollar terms, what's the actual dollar movement in someone's annual rates? You can see the highest one there with the blue $400 scenario is there's over 8,000 properties there that would have an increase of somewhere between 300 and 500 per annum. And just under 6,000 that would have an increase of between 500 and 1,000. Now, I know those are reasonably wide bands, but they give you a sense of the level of increase in the number of properties, both in percentage and in dollar terms. So the application of the $300 uniform charge, you'll see, has less of an impact, marginally, in terms of the number of properties in each of those bands. And so that's one of the factors in deciding to recommend that to you as opposed to the $400 one. And then if you look at subsequent pages of this report, you'll see the similar sorts of information for the commercial sector, so the non-residential ones. Here, as you'd expect, there are some that get decreases, and the extent of the decrease varies depending upon what the uniform charge is. But here there's a bit more of a spread, despite the fact that in general terms there are commercial ratepayers who would have reductions. There are still ratepayers, commercial ones, who would have reasonably significant increases. So that's the case right across the board in almost all sectors, that because of the change of values and the particular individual circumstances of individual properties in different parts of town, the impact is variable. So in the commercial sector, in the dollar sense, of course, the sums involved are also much more variable. And so likewise, no, they're not quite so variable in some of the others. So I guess if I can summarise the position, Mr. Mayor and councillors, it's always a very difficult thing to try to make a recommendation that seems to be appropriate, which balances our overall policies, the knowledge that the base is reset every 3 years as an integral part of the way in which rating occurs, and inevitably, especially in an environment like we've had where values have moved as markedly as they have, there will be variations and different sectors will move in different ways. And so we think that in trying to balance those things, it's a tough call, but it's a fact of life, I think, that some people are going to pay quite a lot more rates than what they've paid previously. This is my best attempt at trying to find something that will hopefully you'll find appropriate. Obviously, we need to update the figures that are shown here to reflect the decisions that you've made today, and our intention will be to do that following the meeting. So I just open to questions.
Good. Thank you, Steve, as always. Very thorough, and appreciate the background work and data and everything that's gone into that. So I'll just open it up for any questions of Steve. I'll start with Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Steve, for taking us through. So what would happen if the UAGC went to 200, 100, or 0?
I didn't model 200, 100, or 0. I modelled 250. Unfortunately, didn't bring that with me today, but the effect is that the residential sector would, the commercial sector, the lower that goes, the more the commercial sector ends up paying, but the bigger the spread ends up being within sectors, and the less effect, I suppose, in terms of the maximum and minimum that's paid in each of the different property groups, and particularly the residential group. So, as I said, I didn't go any lower than 250, but I didn't bring the 250 here today.
Great, thank you. So in terms of, I suppose, the public being able to see that and us being able to see some of that, to understand the data behind what you've presented as a judgment call around landing on a recommendation of 300, would it be possible to generate those models so that we could see the sort of effects that you're alluding to?
Yes, that can be done reasonably quickly, and so I could certainly circulate more information about that to you, just so you have that information to hand. But I guess we are needing to be able to come out of today with a decision so that we can incorporate the information into the material that's prepared for you to adopt at your next meeting. So whilst I can prepare stuff that would help you understand the reason for making these recommendations, in terms of it helping you making a decision at the council level, I think that's a bit late.
Okay, so in terms of, again, the rationale around ensuring that the public has some visibility of that as well, if we were to seek by way of recommendation that we see those models, could that be incorporated to the papers in time to make the 16th of March meeting, so that we would at least have visibility prior to confirming a decision?
Yes, I can prepare additional note to the report that goes to the meeting on the 16th that would demonstrate the effect of a couple of other scenarios, if you wish, at that level.
Thank you. No further questions on that, Mr. Mayor, but just to indicate I will be looking to bring a recommendation to that effect.
Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Steve, for that presentation. I just note that this is the second set of valuations that we've attempted to mitigate the effect of, and the cumulative effect of that is that the commercial sector is now effectively subsidising the residential sector even more. And I wonder if you feel that we've been fair to the commercial sector in the level of burden, if you like, additional burden that we put on them in trying to mitigate the effects on the residential rates.
Tough question, because there's no really right answer in terms of how much is appropriate for the commercial sector to be paying and whether we can justify the level of the surcharge based on the value. So I think we do know that in the commercial sector there are some things in particular where they benefit more so than the residential sector, perhaps for some of the type of spending that we have in bringing people to the city and the flow-on effects of that for some of the things where there are events and economic type stuff that flows into the commercial sector. And so to an extent, some of those things are underlying the thought that it is appropriate to have a surcharge on commercial, and most councils, not all, but most councils come to the conclusion that it is appropriate, depending what rating system they have, underlying that, to have some sort of a commercial differential. As I said, there seems to be no particular right answer as to how much that should be, and of course, if we ended up with a different rating base at some point, it might influence quite significantly the way in which that what we determined would be an appropriate differential and how much the commercial sector could pay overall. Commercial sector seems to me to be one, it's pretty hard to identify as what actually it is, because it varies so much in terms of the makeup of what commercial properties are. We sometimes think about the central city and what we're contributing in that area, and then it of course involves lots of distribution buildings and things in all parts of the town, so of the city. So there's nothing that's sort of a standard commercial property to look at. I think the commercial, a capital value based system would mean perhaps that in different parts of the city, commercial properties of a similar total investment would pay similar amounts, whereas at the moment they pay quite variable amounts depending upon where they're situated. I think what I've tried to bring to you is what I think is a fine line between going too far and charging too much more for the commercial sector, yet still ending up with a sum out of the total commercial sector that's less than what we've had in the past. And it's, I guess, a little bit of a holding pattern in a sense, like we said last time, until we do a much more detailed review to, say, try to determine what we think is an appropriate split.
Okay, thank you. My other question was around the suburb effect. So last time we had a valuation, we had quite large variations from one suburb to the next, and the effects of that were modelled for us, but I see that we haven't gone into that detail this time. Is that because the increase in land values has been fairly evenly spread across the city, irrespective of the suburb? I'm just wondering why we haven't gone down to a suburb level this time when we did last time.
Yes, it's partly to do with the resource we've got available to actually provide the information for you, and we haven't got to that level of effort. We've had staff who've just been so bogged down doing other things, we haven't got to provide that information for you. I'd like to have done that, but haven't just managed it. I think there's less variation in the suburb sense than what there was last time. Not a pronounced suburban change quite so much. I seem to recall in the report that we gave back in December, there was a bit of a suburban sort of split in terms of the value movements, and I just can't remember the details of those, but there was a bit of variability, but perhaps not quite so pronounced as the 3 years previously.
Okay, thank you for that.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve, for your work on this. Just looking at page 65 in the top graph, that the right-hand columns of an increase between 26 and 75%, that's quite a big range. I understand that relates to perhaps, 14 or 1,500 properties. Do you know how many properties would be expecting like more than 50% increase in rates, or
to be honest, I don't know the answer to that at the moment. I, like you, felt this was a fairly big range, and a staff member prepared it for me, and I didn't get to sort of a chance to look more closely at how many were at the higher end. I have a feeling one of the problems we have when we're analysing the data, especially if we're trying to relate it to the very latest data, is that there are quite a few sections where we've removed, where the nature of the section itself has changed from one year to the next, and so we're not really comparing apples with apples, and so sometimes that then means that when we draw the data out of the database, it's showing a change that's more than what's the real change, that if you were comparing apples with apples in terms of a property. It could be, for example, that there's a property that was vacant in the current year, but in the next year actually now has the house on it, and we're applying the uniform charges to it for each of those services, and that would mean that it appears that it's gone up in a lot. So some of the ones in that group would be in that category.
Okay.
And I haven't had a chance to try to understand the extent to which that's the case.
And just a similar question on the next graph down, but just to try and understand the range of how much some people might have. So that over $1,000 increase in rates on that far right-hand column, where we've got maybe, I don't know, a few hundred people, I guess. How much over $1,000 might some people be expecting their rates to increase by? Do you know what the top amounts are for single unit residential? What the top of the range would be?
Yeah, I feel a bit inadequate not being able to answer that, because
no,
I don't know the answer to that at the moment, to be honest. I have a table of stuff there that I could browse at, but I haven't got that in front of me here at the moment.
Yeah.
So I think it's... No, I don't know, but I do know that some of them are ones that would be brought about because of the change in the nature of the property, and there's some quite unusual ones that we describe as single unit properties, which are just not your average house, if you like. They're something that's a bit bigger than that.
Okay, thanks, Steve.
Councillor Harper.
Thanks, Steve. It follows on pretty much from what Councillor Naylor was going on page 66, which is looking at the commercial ones, which is the column right at the bottom on the right, which is over 1,000 that would be affected, and you don't know the number there, but there's quite a number there that would be affected.
Well, certainly in terms of the ones over 1,000, we're saying there that there's over 350 in either of those, or over 300 or 350 in either of those scenarios, it would have an increase of over 1,000. Now, in a sense, a lot of those properties are ones that would pay $30,000 or $40,000 in rates anyway. So 1,000 sounds a lot, but relative to the size of their rates, probably not significant. Well, it's significant, but it's not totally unreasonable in a sense.
Depends on who you are.
I know.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. probably the same kind of question. If we consider commercial, big properties, small properties, a single unit, I'm assuming that maximum number of people or ratepayers will be better off with this.
Well, certainly, if you're looking at the number of rating units and ratepayers, by making the change to the system, there'll be more people paying less than they otherwise would have by adopting this system, yes. But that doesn't necessarily make it right, I'd have to say. It's a matter of a fine balance between what's reasonable and appropriate for the different sectors. I'm not swayed necessarily in terms of making the recommendation by the number of people that are impacted. It's trying to, although a little bit, it's also, it's more about, well, is the outcome as fair as we can make it and as appropriate as we can make it.
Thank you. Okay, I think we might have extinguished most of the questions. I've just got one more, and I think you probably have answered it, but I'll just repeat it. So the lower we go with that UAC, that will push the burden further to commercial. Is that right?
Yes, it does. I'm not sure whether there's a tipping point or not, because I haven't pushed it right to that way, but certainly in general terms, because there's so many fewer of the commercial ones, it does push more into commercial, and that means more of the rates are based on the value as opposed to to being per property. So given the number of relative number of properties, yes, it does push more that way.
Okay, that's cool. We just need to understand that. Okay, all right. Oh, thank you, Steve. We will get, I think there is an additional notice of motion to come up, so we'll get that. Okay, so we've got, so this is around the committee recommending that the uniform annual general charge be modelled at $200, $100 and $0 and reported to Council on the 16th of March 2022. So that's moved by Councillor Barrett, seconded by Councillor Beattie. So Councillor, I'll let you speak to it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this is really just about underscoring the fact that we do seek to make evidence-based decisions here in the chamber, and this gives us the evidence. The officer, quite rightly in my view, indicated that there is a degree of judgment that goes on in these things, and I think that that's our job around this table to exercise that judgment ultimately, and so we need that evidence. So I'd ask you to support.
Is there anybody else that wishes to speak? I will comment. Look, I don't think there's any harm in bringing that forward, but I think the answer I just got, we're just got to be careful with the integrity of the rating system. Although some may want to spread it further afield, I think it's helpful to understand what that is. But I think the officers have sort of explored a few of these things. But look, let's bring it out to the council table on the 16th. If we do this, we can still make those changes. We're quite nimble enough to pop things in because we effectively are going to not give you any direction on number 2.
Correct. We can cope with some things to be changed. I guess it depends on the extent of the change that happened. So we'll come prepared to be able to make changes if we really have to. But desirably at the council meeting, it's more of a rubber stamp, although we do recognise this time we've got more gaps in some of our material, and so the intention that we've got at this stage is at least to reproduce the supporting information and the CD for the council meeting. In the past, sometimes we haven't done that. We might have reproduced the CD, but not the other material. But I suspect because of the extent of the gaps that we have at the moment, then we'll be looking to bring the whole of the stuff back.
So that's yes, you can do this. Yeah. Okay, cool. No, oh, no, sorry, there is one more. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just seeking some clarification around this notice of motion. This is in addition to the notice of motion in 2, is it? Or is it intended to be instead of?
I think it's an addition, but we are going to, so we're going to vote on this one first. If it succeeds, it means that that bit of work comes forward to us, but then we still vote on number 2 because we need to have a starting point. And that just gives us other information to be able to, I suppose, base some decisions on.
That's good, because I was going to say that I would be moving too if we were doing one or the other. But if we're coming back to the substantive of 2, then that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's where I was going. No disrespect to the mover and second, but it came out of left field, so I wasn't aware that was coming. But we'll deal with it. Let's get it up on screen. I'll come back to you, Councillor, for any right of reply. No, doesn't need it. Okay, we'll vote. And that has passed 14 votes for and 1 abstention. Okay. Okay, we now move to the annual budget plan 2022-23, adopting the supporting information and the consultation document. The committee recommends that the annual budget, including an assumption of differentials for the general rate, will be modified as outlined in Table 1 of the report, and that the uniform annual general charge will be $300. Okay, so I'm quite, okay, Councillor Dennison, you're happy to move that, with a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Butt. I'll open it up for you, Councillor Dennison, to speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. At this point, we've got to make decisions of the best information that we've got, and I think what the information that we've got does indicate is that 300 is the most reasonable of the options that we have to date for single unit, residential, commercial, and the impact. So understanding those differentials have been adjusted. What I am open to, though, is that other information coming back to us at council. I think that is wise, and so I reserve my overall decision for that council meeting. But for today, I think we do need to give a steer, and this is the best information we've got, and so I'm happy to move. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm also happy to support this, but I think there's no harm in seeing that additional information. Look, this does really highlight quite a challenging situation for us, and I think we're going to have to think carefully how we're going to have to be ready to respond to ratepayers who potentially have an increase in rates of between 26 and 75%. You know, there's over 1,000 ratepayers who are going to be in that position. We've got a few hundred ratepayers who are going to be paying more than $1,000 a year in rates. You know, that's going to hit some people pretty hard. And we do have limited levers that we can pull to actually influence this. I mean, one of the reasons that I've worked so hard to try and see if there's areas that we can pull back in a year when there's revaluations and the distribution of the rates has such a significant effect on rates to people. I think that's a year that we've got to really think about the limited levers that we can pull. And one of those levers is actually the amount of increase in rates overall. And I'm extremely disappointed with where we've landed that today. I mean, this is simply a draft. But this is the backdrop, this is the context that we really need to actually think about when we're actually addressing the overall rates increase as well. But definitely happy to support this recommendation.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and with apologies because this perhaps could have been addressed through questions, but recommendation 1 makes explicit reference to the draft annual budget. This recommendation refers to the annual budget. I would like to see something happen that just happened. That's like a magic wand. Provided the mover and seconder are comfortable that we specify this is draft at this stage. My rationale around that is much along the lines of Councillor Dennison and others. I think we do need to do something today, given that we're in the meeting, but I am very much not of the view that a vote in support of this is actually a vote endorsing a $300 because we haven't actually seen the range of differentials yet to give us an evidence base to properly make that decision on. So I'm comfortable now that it refers to draft to vote
and
in
for the
support.
record, both myself and Councillor Butt are happy with that. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, councillors. Look, I'll support this, and look, it will be interesting to see what the other UAG charges come back at. But I do think there is the integrity of the system is at risk if we get too hard on certain sectors and try to equalise it out too much. We're in a challenging position. I'll leave the rest of my comments to at the end of 3. I'm of the view that I'm not entirely comfortable where we're at, but we know why. Okay, no further comments. Any right of reply, Councillor?
Thank you, Councillor Barrett, just for that draft word. I think that was my intention when I spoke, but thanks for capturing that. And the only other thing I just wanted to highlight is that these assumptions are done on a 7% total rate, and I'm not sure if it has a major effect if it goes on at 8.3, but maybe that could also be updated too when we get the other modelling. Thank you.
I'm getting nods. Yeah, I'm sure they can do it. Okay, we'll vote, please. Two to come, please. Check that you've voted. We've got it. Thank you. 16 for, none against. Thank you. All right, we go to number 3, and this is around the consultation document and information. So I'll come back to you, Steve.
Yes, please. As you'd be aware, in terms of adopting an annual plan, the council can choose, if it believes that if there isn't such a significant difference between what's in the plan and what was in the 10-year plan, then not to consult formally. We've assumed, though, that it's your wish, based on your previous decisions on these matters, to have a consultation period, which we've called public engagement because there are different forms of ways in which we can share stuff with the public and get them involved in giving feedback. But having called it public engagement, though, we're still preparing what we've called the formal consultation document in accordance with the legislation and the supporting information that's required to be adopted at the same time. So drafts of those with intentionally left gaps in places because we needed to hear your decisions from today to fill those. Then our move after today is to try to finalise those documents, finalise in the sense of bringing them together to represent the decisions you've made today, and to have no gaps left, really, for publication for your meeting next week, recognising that there may still be the odd thing that you, well, hopefully no changes to the overall level of the sum for the total rates increase or the amount of rates, because if that is really problematic to handle beyond the council meeting. We could cope perhaps with some changes to the structure of the rating system, but anything that would change the whole of the overall rates position and the finances right through is a fundamental change that requires more work than we can really cope with after the council meeting before we're due to start the consultation. So with those sort of caveats, that we're now, as I said, I think the supporting information is relatively straightforward in a sense, because all of that's doing is showing the detail of the financial information at an activity level, describing the main changes between what's in year 2 of the plan and what's proposed in the budget, the odd formal bit of information that's required under the legislation. So the key thing then is what might form part of the consultation document and how we would be engaging with the public. Our communication staff and our planning staff are working on how we might go about that in terms of the interacting with the public and getting some feedback from them, and there'll be various channels that are used for that. So the document itself, it's not proposed that this would be delivered to households or anywhere. It'll be made available in electronic form and at libraries and buildings, council buildings and the like, as the core formal document. It's intended that there would be a household drop for a flyer to point people in the direction of where to find things like this if they wanted more information, and the supporting information as well. So in a sense, it's those messages that are getting out there to the public about the fact that we are preparing the plan and the like that become important. And the real challenge, I think, that we always find each year is how best to pose questions that might provide us with useful answers about things, given that a great deal of what we're producing is material that's in effect taking the same direction as what the 10-year plan's saying, but in this case a bit of a deferment in a number of programs, and the story about the deferment's something that we can say and identify that. And then the other big issue really is, well, the two big issues that I've mentioned in the report there. There's the deferments, and they're sort of, in a sense, COVID-influenced deferments, and the cost of things changing as a result of all of that as well, that whole big picture about where we find ourselves in a practical sense. And then the other major issue is about the redistribution as a result of the revaluation. So 3 years ago, our document, we put a fair bit of focus on trying to explain the revaluation impacts and the like, and so we're thinking that the vast majority of people's concerns will be built around trying to understand what the impact is on them of the of the increase, and so having a way of describing that. People will be able to log on to onto our website and look at what the proposed rates will be for them, specifically for their property, and there'll be staff who can obviously handle inquiries about that people have. So there's a draft here of the document, and so I guess we're interested in any comments people may have, so that we can try and capture those. And
okay, there's a few. I'll start. Just the length, and look, generally, Steve, thank you, firstly, and the other staff. And I do think you're right in the way you've approached the revaluations and trying to show some examples there. Just a couple of comments. Page 17, where we make that equivalent to what bread and milk costs are, I think that's going to rankle people. I mean, we're past that now, I believe, personally. And it was helpful a few years ago, but I don't think it's a great way of showing that equivalent. I may be just by myself in that, but I'm just not sure about it. Page 7, we make the comments around or show the remuneration of elected members. We've got absolutely no, that's not our decision at all. That's made at a national level. And it will create a discussion where we're voting for ourselves, and we absolutely have no impact on that at all. And the second one is, I'm pretty happy with the others that you've gathered, but we go the Manawatu Jet sponsorship, which is pretty insignificant, yet it's highlighted. I'm just unsure why we're doing that, but again, I may be the only one in that space. Sorry.
I just got a comment on that one. Yes, in terms of determining what to put in here, I put a line through some that people had put in here as well, because I thought they were insignificant in scale relative to the big things. And yep, I agree with you that the Jets one is probably in that category in terms of the amount as well. And certainly in terms of the remuneration, if that is to be mentioned, then it would be changed to reflect the fact that the remuneration authority.
Yep, okay, all right. Some of the language too, certainly on page 3. My personal comments is, yes, there is shifting sands of the pandemic and everything, but we've pretty well stayed to where we're going. So that probably does need to be reflected somewhere, because it doesn't really say that. And some of the imagery, I think it would be good to show some more infrastructure pics, because, Cloverley Roundabout, for instance, rather than perhaps the Peace Park. But I know the marketing people have done some balancing there. I believe we overshow Papiawea Place, and I know it's a really significant and vital project and facility. But Memorial Park's been a real winner for a lot of mainstream residents. Perhaps that could be shown more, and we could replace some of the imagery on page 4. Page 10, we talk about gross debt. Is that traditionally what we referred to it, Steve, or have we done net?
We have traditionally talked about gross debt.
Okay,
yes.
all right, we'll just go with what's right. And maybe on page 12, that sunshine image, it could be the bridge or the pathway, steps of Tane or something. It just seemed to be a bit of a nothing pick, but the rest of it, look, it's modelled on what we've done previously. As you say, 3 years it worked pretty well, but just my general comments. Right, I'll go to other councillors. Quite a lot waiting. Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. There's just a couple of areas I wanted to ask questions about. So the first one is, Steve, your comment around this is the last opportunity to add any spending that might affect the budget. I'm aware that next week in community development there's a paper coming which, if agreed, would result in an extra programme being added to the annual budget. And I'm just wondering, is it absolutely too late to add anything in 2 weeks' time, or what is the process if, for example, this programme that's going to be debated next week is approved by council? At what stage would we be able to get that out for consultation as part of the annual budget?
We always strike this problem, Councillor, in terms of where to put the peg in the sand and things crossing over. So from my perspective, we're needing to sign this off, really, absolutely, on the 16th. And so to change any component of the total spend beyond today, in my view, is just meaning that we wouldn't be able to cope with doing what needs to be done. So there are, I was thinking about ways of, if you're wanting to, if you feel that the issue is one that would be something that needs to be consulted on publicly, That does raise a slight problem in terms of how we'd cope with it. About the only way that I can think of, which meeting's it coming to, did you say?
Community development.
Yes. And that's before or after the 16th?
It's on the 9th.
Yeah, next week. So I guess there could be a comment of something mentioned somewhere in the CD, potentially, as a very last minute sort of thing, but to build it into the figures at this stage would be too late in my view. It would be something we would have to maybe say that we would cope with in terms of thinking about as part of the, in May, once the feedback, and we were looking at all the changes as a result of submissions and the like.
Not quite the answer I was looking for, but thank you. So then my other area of questioning is around slide 9, which in your presentation around the better off funding, and we also have an attachment of possible options for spending of a portion of better off funding, but there hasn't been a recommendation about it, and we haven't had any debate about it. But I would like, I don't know if this is a question to Steve or to the mayor or whoever, I would like some discussion of whether or not we are going to agree to include the better off funding portion in the draft annual budget. I mean, I personally would like to do that. If it takes a recommendation, then I'm happy to put one up, but perhaps someone could advise.
I'll just, Councillor, I mean, it's a good question because we didn't have a lot of information at the time of pulling this all together. So I might just get Cameron. Is there a latest? Cameron?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have endeavoured to include within this pack of material some discussion around the better off funding. It would be good to have a discussion if there is some feelings as to what is included and what isn't included. The risk that I see in terms of this funding is we are still haven't got the definitive answer from DIA, but we are pretty certain, I think, that we're going to receive this, and the rationale that was set out in the DIA's heads of agreement gives us a way of understanding what they're seeking in terms of applying against funding. So that was some of the material that has been since circulated too. So happy to have that discussion on that.
Well, will I see that better off funding is a means? Some of it is proposed to be applied to capital budgets, but some of it is proposed to be applied to operational projects. And I would see that would be a better way, in my view, of reducing the impact on rates than the other attempts that have been made earlier. So since this funding is available to us, can we not debate whether or not we want to add it into the annual budget at this point?
Yes, and I'd be happy to hear those views. So what we have done is tried to canvass the things that we think would actually fit the criteria when we're asked to fit it within the criteria and applying. We have two options here, Councillor, and that is that we can tag those items, some of those items that have been circulated, and include it in the draft annual budget, or we can await until we've got final information from the DIA in terms of being sure of how to apply that and use that to inform our final budget. So I'm quite happy for some discussion on that and views.
Okay, thank you. Well, Mr. Mayor, then I'd like to add an additional recommendation that the draft annual budget include options for uses of better off funding.
Yep, just get something up to the administrator, and as long as you've got a second, we'll go through that. Look, councillors, I've got 6 of you in the queue wanting to ask questions. I've now got 2 notices of motion coming to us. They've then got a comment. So I'm just going to take a very, very quick, we've been going for 2 hours solid, so we're going to take a 10-minute break and come back. I'm sorry to those that are waiting, but I can see this going right through till 5 at least. Okay, so we'll be back in the chamber here at, we'll just say 20 past. All right, thank you. Right. Now, Lorna's put through that notice of motion, and we might, Councillor Johnson has put through that notice of motion, and Cameron, you'd just like to speak to that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just been reflecting a little bit on the Better Off funding and the concern from myself with including this in the draft annual budget is because we are still awaiting for the final guidance from DIA as to how this should be applied. There is a concern that we could be committing to something that might look a little bit different when that finally comes through. Also, just note that part of the criteria within the use that we currently know of from the original heads of agreement does state that we should be consulting and working with iwi and so forth, and none of our options to date that we've thought of, we've canvassed their thoughts. So I think we probably have a little bit of way to go before we are ready to give a really good series of options for the use of that funding, and just concerned that we might end up committing to something that potentially might not be what the final representation from central government for its use is.
Okay, thank you for that. So I'll just go back to the mover and the seconder. What would you like to do? Councillor Johnson.
I'm just wondering, do we have to assign the funding to a project, or could we just include the funding and apply it against the bottom line and say that the precise projects in which we might apply the funding have yet to be determined? Because my understanding is it isn't necessarily that we would be producing new projects, but that we would be looking at work that was already scheduled and deciding whether or not it met the criteria to use this funding, and then applying the funding. So rather than see the funding designated against a series of specific programme lines at the moment, could we not include it as an offset, if you like, financially, and make a statement that we have yet to determine the precise programmes that it would be allocated against? Would that be an option?
I'll just get some officer advice.
Sarah Sinclair, CIO, through the chair. Really good question. We tabled this with the anticipation that by the time this came up, we would have had more guidance from the government on this Better Off funding. The guidance that we're currently working on is actually the guidance that we tabled to you as part of the response to part of the feedback response in September last year, which was very generic. It indicated a range of community-focused elements that the Better Off funding might be used for. As examples, it indicated that the allocation of funds would be, as Cameron said, with iwi cognizance, but it didn't articulate any governance of how that actual iwi involvement in decision making would be done. So we've got this very broad number, and all that's happened since then is the government has come out and said that they're going to make some available early, and we know that it's for community-focused elements, and that it's for and that it has to have iwi decision making in it. But the level of detail, we literally don't know whether we could apply it to existing projects or whether it would only be new things. We don't know whether we could apply it to capital or operational. We just haven't got that level of detail yet.
Okay, well, that was not apparent to me from the information on the slide, nor from the appendix that was supplied as information to this meeting, where it was very specifically applied. So, I mean, I can only take your advice. If you don't think that we can include this at this stage, then I'll withdraw the proposal. But I seem to be getting different advice now than the information we were given prior to the meeting.
Yeah, and look, I think Cameron did allude to that. So, Cameron, can you?
Yeah. So yes, recognise that, and some apologies for that. I think what we were hoping for was to have a little bit of that additional guidance from DIA, and also to give elected members some ideas as to what we think at this stage it could be applied against. And because we haven't yet got that final confirmation, at this stage it makes it very difficult to include. In terms of using it as an offset against the bottom line, that has some challenges as well, because how much do we apply against operating versus capital versus other items which have different funding mechanisms. So at this stage it probably isn't well fleshed enough to be able to include, in my view, in terms of this draft annual budget phase. And apologies if I've caused some confusion with that.
But we could put something in the... Sorry, but we could put something in the consultation document that talks about that between now and when we finalise the annual budget, we're likely to get greater clarity about how it could be applied, which could result in a reduction of the rates if it was applied to operational.
Okay, I guess I'm wondering if staff need any direction from elected members around the inclusion of this funding once we know what we could use it for. Because if you feel you need that direction, I could modify the recommendation such that it could be included later. Or is this something that you want to bring back to us for a decision at a later date?
The way I see it is, I think we've got two options here. One is to include within this consultation document that we haven't allocated this funding, but we're going to consider it, as the acting chief executive has mentioned. I think that could be useful in terms of informing the public as to where we are with it. And I think we would be working with elected members once we have that guidance as to how that could be applied. And I think we would be seeking your direction around how we would envision applying that funding and over what time period as well. My understanding, although albeit limited, is it's not necessarily a use it in 1 year type funding. So, but that's still to be fully confirmed.
Okay, well then I think with the indulgence of the seconder, I better withdraw the recommendation.
Okay, thank you. And look, we'll just ask the officers to keep in touch with us on that. It sounds like it's a bit of a moving feast with every day. So, thank you. All right, we better keep moving because we've got a lot to get through. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks, Steve and Cam. Two areas, one of which might get us moving a bit faster. Just wanted to get your take on whether you'd be comfortable with sort of a minor edits type approach to the consultation document. I, like the Mayor, have a raft of feedback, but probably not things that would be incorporated through formal motions.
From my perspective, yes, although we'd need to set a time frame of, within the next day or two to get those back to us, please. And if that happened, they'd come direct through Courtney as our person who'll collate that information.
Great, understood. So I've got a recommendation to that effect here. The second one is really to understand, I suppose, the rationale around the engagement and that sort of thing, and that we have one online session, but principally we're talking about face-to-face sessions with sort of councillors rostered on to be spoken with, etc. And wondering around the wisdom of that balance, given the times that we're in terms of the objective uncertainty around how far COVID will be into the community in March and April, as well as the more subjective discomfort that some people feel with face-to-face interactions at these times. Have we got the balance right there?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we have had some discussions around that. There are challenges, obviously being COVID red has its challenges, and by having some online presence through what we're proposing here means that we still enable some face-to-face interaction, but that is really some direction that you're able to provide if you have some views on that. I guess we're trying to find a balance of being able to interact with our communities and also keeping ourselves safe.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful to hear. So I suppose my preference would be that we could get some options around that reflect the uncertainty around the need to have more digital opportunities. I'll just leave it there for now. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
So, Councillor, we don't need a notice of motion from you around minor edits. It's a draft, and that will just take that as being a given. Okay, Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a small comment on this consultation document. On page 7, when I read that we need some more money for something, and when I read the remuneration is on number 3, it gives me the impression that it might be doubled or tripled in the next year. So is there a criteria in arranging these items, or it's just a random?
Quite got the sense of what your concern is.
What I mean is when you read this page 7, and if I am reading it, that what we are needing more money for, number 3 is the remuneration changes in elected members. So it gives me the impression that it is a big factor which is requiring money.
True, and we did talk about that a little bit earlier, and I think we'll either revise the way that's written or remove that. I just want to have a talk about that.
I'd prefer it that if you moved it, because we've got no control over it, and I think you're creating a fire which shouldn't really be even lit.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. So this is our time to give feedback about the consultation document. Just a few things. I agree with Councillor Barrett around the online options. We do need more of those. On page 18, it looks like there's just the one Facebook one and the rest look like they're in person. I think we definitely need to have less in-person ones and more online. Looking at page 7, I think we probably need to put actual amounts to each of those things to give the community context. And I agree that there's no point putting something in here where it's not a decision that we have any influence over. So I think the remuneration for elected members, we would be inviting a whole lot of comments that we can't actually have any control over. So I don't see any point having things in there that we can't actually change. The main feedback I have is actually around the commentary on page 3. I'm actually I'm quite uncomfortable around some of the messaging, particularly it's talking about how hard it is for our individuals, families, etc. out there at the moment, and then we're saying that's not okay when your bills are going up. So we've taken a hard look at our work, thinking about what we could delay. I just don't feel I think that's quite misleading. In fact, I'd go as far as saying it's dishonest to be communicating that to our community when actually the main thing that influences rates is operational expenses, and we haven't trimmed back our overall operational expenditure. We've put it up. And so I just think we need to be honest about that. If we're talking about the capital program and the deferral of that, then we need to be more specific about that. Although, I don't expect that the average ratepayer has any understanding about the difference between capital expenditure and operational expenditure in terms of how that affects their rates increase. So I think the way this is written, I've heard people before say this needs to be targeted to a 9 or 10-year-old. I think there's a lot of talk of construction supply issues. supply chain constraints, supply chain issues. That kind of language, I think we need to the language needs to be a lot more basic. And I think we need to be a little bit more honest about what the plan includes and what it doesn't include. Yes, we've deferred some capital programs, but we certainly haven't. I don't believe we've taken a hard look at our work, thinking about what we could adjust in terms of operational, which is the one that affects rates. So I don't know, the reason I've brought that up now is I don't know if that's a minor amendment or if how we give direction, if we're wanting to change that. I also feel like it's not very personal. I think if we're wanting engagement, elected members are invisible in this document. Normally you'd have a picture of the mayor and his signature on a message, and perhaps he would have had input into it. I think if we're wanting people to engage with us as elected members, we probably do need to actually be visible somewhere in the document. Yeah, I think it's actually a little bit insulting to be acknowledging how hard it is for families, etc. And I mean, the fact that some people are going to get a 50% or a 75% rates increase. So I don't know how we frame that, but I think we actually need to acknowledge that the valuations somewhere in here, in that introduction, and the impact that will have, because I think people are going to get a big shock when some of our, there's quite a lot of our ratepayers are going to have over $1,000 increase in rates, etc., or close to, and many in that $500 to $1,000 increase. So I think we need to actually acknowledge that somehow and frame that in a more honest way. So I need to probably have some indication of whether that can be done through minor amendments or how we can test that or give direction to that today.
So I think the comms team here are listening to that.
Yes.
I do think there does need to be a sentence around the revaluations. It is certainly well signalled in later pages, but certainly at the front it isn't. And I think that's where I was going with my general comments around language.
I think, excuse me, Mr. Mayor, I think certainly we take that on board, and I too would agree that I think in this front page or two it should say something about the revaluation.
Yeah.
Our comms staff are the ones who, I suppose, wordsmithing this bit for us, and they're listening in, and so we can have a chat to them to reflect the sort of flavour of what you're saying to see if we can.
Yeah, and we'll look, as we have done in the past, we will circulate it to you all in the next day or two, and seek your feedback. I don't think it's something we may not all totally 100% agree on, but if we can get some sort of middle ground there, I think that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Okay. I had Councillor Bowen. You've disappeared.
Asked and answered, thank you.
Okay. Now, Councillor Dingwell, you've got a notice of motion. Is that what you want to talk to? No, you're on mute.
Sorry, wrong one. Yes, it was. So I was just starting to get a bit unclear as to whether we're still asking questions to staff or whether we're providing feedback, and when I should be talking about this notice of motion.
Yep, sorry, you were last on the list, but now there's a whole lot of others jumped in. So what we'll do is we'll finish asking any questions of the officers, and then I'll come back to you. I've got a list here for you around your notice of motion. So if you've got any questions of the staff, fire away now.
Okay, I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Councillor Beattie.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just two final things. Page 7, it's got, we need less money for nature calls, and that's actually not true. It's a case of swapping OPEX for CAPEX, so I think our ratepayers won't understand that, so I think we just need to sort that out.
Yes, we can look at that and highlight the difference in type of funding.
Yeah, well, it's not, because it says we need less money, and it's a big thing because this has been a big project, and suddenly it's like, oh, are we not having to, So
I can see how that would send mixed messages, and we can clear that up.
My other thing is the animal shelter. And it is a dog shelter, not an animal shelter. And it's not so much that, it's the city's furry friends. I mean, it sounds like some SPCA thing that we've got. And it isn't, it's a dog pound for...
It's not, I think you're not allowed to call it a dog pound.
Well, we can call it a dog shelter or an animal, I don't mind the animal shelter, I'm not.
There's sheep there. I've been rustling some sheep and seen them there.
But it's just, if you could just take the city's furry friends out of there, like it doesn't have rabbits and cats and things.
We just send them to your place, councillor. Okay. All right, Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. So I just wanted to make some comments around the discussion about whether or not page 3, we've taken a hard look at our work, is an honest statement or not. And I'm not happy that we take that out, because actually I think we have taken a hard look. We've had a whole day in a workshop looking at stuff. This is the second day now of debate and meetings where we've gone through things line for line. I consider that to be a very hard look, plus all the preparation that elected members have done for all of these meetings, as well as staff. So I think we have taken a very hard look, and I would be unhappy if that were to be removed. So I've just caution changes being made on the comments of 1 or 2 elected members. If we're going to make significant changes like that, I think they need to be agreed by all of us.
Okay. That may be a little bit difficult, unless somebody wants to put up any notices of motion. But I don't disagree with you. There has been a hard look at things. That can perhaps stay.
I think our comms people, in conjunction with our planning people, can make the odd small change to this to give the sense of what you're after, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, and to be honest, we've still got the 16th to tweak things if we have to, although we don't really want to be messing around with too much. And it is a draft. It is a consultation document, so it's not the final locked-in thing. Okay. All right. I'll go back to you, Councillor Dingwell. You've got a notice of motion. We'll bring that up. We'll get it up in a moment. Okay, this is around a notice of motion to include in the CD information and questions to gain community feedback on whether reference group members, advisory group members and youth council members should be offered COHA, paid meeting fees and or reimbursement of expenses. So that's moved by you, Councillor Dingwell, seconded by Councillor Barrett. Would you like to speak to it, please?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this one here is an interesting one, I think. Last year, when we went through the long-term plan, we had a submitter that ended up speaking to us about the need for a Pacifica reference group. And in the discussions that followed, we set up the Pacifica reference group and the senior reference group alongside the disability reference group. And so I think with this annual budget, what I would like to see is a bit more community feedback on how we treat the members who end up on these different groups. And so when I look at it, they are most definitely volunteers. They end up joining these groups because they are passionate about that community engagement, and they're actually providing us a really useful service, which is why we're setting them up in the first place. And so we need that community engagement with them, and we need the specialist kind of knowledge that they have through their lived experiences. And when I look at it, often they end up being more vulnerable members of the community. So you've got seniors, you've got people with disabilities, and you've got Pacifica, who, you know, often we find them in the lowest pay brackets in paid employment. But for these groups, we're looking at how they engage with us and how they volunteer on the different panels. When we look at precedent and what happens around the country, Wellington has several of these groups. So they've got an accessibility group, environmental, Pacifica, and Rainbow. And they pay their members $110 per meeting for up to 12 meetings per annum. The chair, they end up paying $150 per meeting. They also pay reimbursement for personal expenses for members with physical impairments to help them get to and from those meetings. And they also pay $40 per hour if a support person is required to attend those meetings. So that's Wellington. Auckland tends to have a maximum, Auckland has disability, ethnic peoples, Pacifica, Rainbow, seniors and youth, and their meetings are a max of 3 meetings and 7 workshops per annum, and they also pay meeting fees and reimbursement of personal expenditure. So when I look at what we did for our groups in the terms of reference in December, what PNCC has agreed to is a designated council officer for admin support and an appropriate venue for these meetings. And so I guess what I'm looking at is whether that's actually enough and whether we should be doing more to support the volunteers that end up on these groups. Now, in terms of the budget side of things, I feel like this is actually a minuscule amount in the grand scheme of things. And it could very well be included in operational expenditure. I don't know. But the question that I'm trying to gain through the consultation document is more around how the community expects these volunteers to be treated, and whether they think that paying a koha or paying meeting fees or paying reimbursement fees should be included in these panel groups that we are setting up. And so in the consultation document on page 21, we are already asking them what they think of the Heritage Advisory Panel. And I think it would be a really good idea if we included in there somewhere as well how we treat them. And so that's why I've put up that recommendation. Thank you.
Okay, before we open it up, the acting CE just would like to provide a comment.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I understand the Councillor Dingwell's intention of this consultation. I guess the point I would make is it's quite a specific question to ask in a consultation document on an annual budget without a lot of supporting information. So I think there's a risk that we do consultation poorly. So typically when we would consult on a matter like this, we might have options, costs, an analysis of the engagement we've already undertaken. So I think this piece of work would benefit from some engagement and broader assessment and discussion with the elected members before there was a specific question asked via a consultation document with not a lot of other supporting information. I guess in summary what I'm saying is the risk, I think it's effectively results in a poor consultation exercise.
Okay, thank you. There is a couple of members wanting to speak. I'll just start because I did actually respond to the councillor when she asked the question, I think yesterday or the day before. I think this is around expectations, and I do agree with the acting CE. I have no problems with this coming back as a report, and we sort of understand what people think and the community thinks as well. Sticking this in the CD and saying, do you think reference groups should be paid? I think we'll know what the answers will be. But look, reference groups are traditionally volunteer-based, and thus they shouldn't really be seeking a meeting fee. But if it goes beyond service and community advice and enters into expert advice, which the elected member talked about, which was around the heritage, that's a bit different. And that could be addressed at the time and that possibly is paid by council like a consultant, or in the same way we engage with consultants and bring them on. About reimbursements, yeah, I think reimbursements are fair enough, but again, they all need to be, that needs to be, I think, thought through. But to me, this is all around expectations and what are we trying to create. So I wouldn't support this in its current form, but I would support a discussion around it in a proper manner around the council table. I mean, we don't have to do this overnight. Some of these groups haven't even met yet, so that could be something that we could go through at a later date. So that's just my views. Right, Councillor Dennison.
Yeah, probably just very briefly, a bit like you've outlined. I think this is a conversation for another time, not necessarily posing it out to the community when we haven't even worked out if it's something that we could consider in the options and whatever else the acting CEO outlined. So I prefer it didn't go out in an ad hoc type of way and have a bit more thought and optionality around it. Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Certainly quite comfortable with the prospect of asking the community in principle where they sit on this, and I think that's what we're seeking here. We haven't attached any budget to it. We haven't said, anything specific. We simply want to know in principle, is this a direction the community would like us to go or not? And yes, we could set up a whole reporting and independent consultation on this specific item, but I suspect then the critique of it would be, why are we doing tens of thousands of dollars of effort into a consultation exercise around a very, very few dollars? This is actually a simple, in principle question that can be addressed adequately through the existing consultation document. It relates to recent activity of council where we have established these groups, and we'll get some good feedback in terms of whether or not the community thinks that in principle this is a direction that we should establish, and from there we can then proceed to make subsequent decisions. So I think this is a great example actually of something that will not only increase engagement in the consultation exercise that we're about ready to undertake, but will also give us some valuable feedback from the community in terms of navigating the way forward. The actual question, in my view, is actually quite subjective. Clearly some councils have gone the path of paying, some other councils have not, and that's why I think it really sits really strongly with the importance of getting community feedback at an in-principle level before we proceed. So I'd urge you to support it on that basis.
Councillor Johnson.
Sorry, I've just taken myself out of the queue, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Hancock.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And yeah, look, I understand the sentiment that lies behind this particular recommendation, but I think given lack of detail with the question posed in the consultation document, I think we'd have to be aware of the answer that might not support the groups that we want to actually support. So for those reasons, I won't support it. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I won't be supporting this either. Through my engagement with the Disability Reference Group, this subject has come up a couple of times, and in fact the chair and other members of that group were quite clear that they didn't think that that was something that they would support or thought was necessary, and my concern is that it would actually change the nature of a group for them to become paid members. I think I agree with the Mayor, it's an engagement with it's a mechanism to engage with our community, but it's a voluntary way, and there's many groups across the city who contribute in a voluntary way, and I think what we could, we've got to be careful what we ask for here. We could set up a two-tier system, whereas there's some groups that are getting paid and other groups that aren't getting paid, and I think it's a can of worms. I certainly don't want to go there.
Okay, back to you, Councillor Bowen.
Sorry, just popped in there. I'm not convinced on this one, and I probably won't vote for it to go into the consultation document, but I will just say that we already have a two-tier system. Volunteers on our Creative Communities Fund get paid to be volunteers there. So that might not be well known, and that's because it's a government scheme, not a city council scheme. but it's administered by City Council. And as far as the community is concerned, it is City Council. So if you think this keeps it clean, then that's not good basis for a decision.
Okay, back to you, Councillor Dingwell, for right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you everybody for your comments on that. I guess from where I'm standing, I do think that it is important to put in the consultation document at this stage for several reasons. One is that I guess basically when is the appropriate time to talk about this? When the terms of reference for those reference groups came to council in December during the community development meeting, I did actually ask about the payment side of things, about the resourcing around it. And I was specifically told that that would be discussed within the groups when they set up their own individual specific sort of terms of references. And so I don't quite understand how that will be possible if it's not even budgeted for anywhere at all. As well as that, I've spent 15 years supporting volunteers across hundreds of community groups, and there is always, or should always be, some sort of budget to support them, whether it's like feeding them at their meetings with tea and coffee, or if it's giving them a thank you to say, thanks for your hard mahi, or sending them a Christmas card. I don't know. You have to do something to say thank you to your volunteers. And so I think for me, this specific one is around the principle of how we treat our volunteers. And so that's why I've put it forward in this point, because the feedback that we'll get from it will help to direct whether or not we need to, factor that into the budget at all. And I imagine if we did have to factor it into the annual budget, it would be a minuscule amount that probably would already be in operating budgets. But that's why I decided to put it in, and I urge you to vote for it for our volunteers.
Okay, thank you. We'll now vote. Okay, that has failed. 9 votes against and 3 for. Thank you. All right, we will look now to put the substantive up around the annual budget plan 2022-23, the adopting supporting information and consultation document. The committee recommends 3, that the Chief Executive incorporate the outcomes from recommendation 1 in the updated versions of the supporting information and consultation document to be presented for adoption at the council meeting on 16th of March 2022. I'll look for a mover for that, please. Thank you, Councillor Barrett. A seconder. Thank you, Councillor Hancock. All right, over to you, Councillor Barrett, if you want to speak to this.
No particular comment at this stage. I see this largely as the next stage in process to make sure that we're well and truly on the road for the 16th of March.
All right. No further comments? Okay, there is, sorry. Councillor Naylor. Councillor Naylor.
Sorry, I thought you said Councillor Beattie. Sorry, I must be going deaf. Look, I'll keep it short because I've probably said most of what I need to say today, but I will be voting against this just because I'm not comfortable overall with where we've landed today in terms of the rates increase. It's far from what I'm comfortable with in the current environment.
Before I go back to Councillor Barrett, in a normal year, and I look at our ambition, and it says small city benefits and big city ambition. And in a normal year, I'd be leading the charge that we should be doing everything that we said we're going to do. but actually we're not in a ambitious year. I don't believe we are. Although the city's well placed, we're going to lose the small city benefits very, very quickly, and starting with affordability. So I believe we're in a very, very difficult position of being a price taker. Our officers have said that. Along with COVID, the labour market, fuel, geopolitical situation around the world, this is not a time where we should be just ploughing on regardless of what's going on. We have a real right to be listening to our people, listening to our ratepayers, listening to our residents, and I just hope they come out and tell us that we've got this quite wrong. So in the very unusual position, I won't be voting for this either. So back to you, Councillor Barrett.
Thank you for that, Mr. Mayor, and clearly at least some elected members did want to see this as more than a process motion, so I will comment briefly to say that my view differs from the two comments just made. I think we have actually done quite a bit of work to date, as has been recently commented on in this meeting, and I would say that the staff in particular have done an enormous amount of work, and that we are not merely plowing on. We are taking a very considered view of actually the challenges that face this city, the challenges that face this organization, and are now taking that view to the community and seeking their input. And unlike some other comments, I don't think we should be trying to spin the input one way or another. I think we should just take it to the community and see what they would like us to do next with what we presented to them.
All right, thank you, Councillor. We will now vote. I know there's a couple that have just popped in, but sorry, there is a process, and it is 5:05, and people have been here for a long, long day. Okay, please vote. All right, that has passed 9 votes for and 3 against. Thank you, people. I just want to acknowledge the staff too. Thank you, Councillor Barrett, for doing that. That was an oversight by me. I appreciate the work, especially our finance team and comms team have done to get us where we are. And appreciate the governance team who've hung on a little bit longer than they actually wanted to. But thank you, everybody. Have a good evening. Same to those online.